This is Paul Johnson with the New Frontiers. We have a great show today with outstanding experts who are going to talk about the Democratic Convention and the race between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. Now, I'm just an ordinary, optimistic American, as you'll see all the way at the end of this show, who still believes that the United States is a cause for good. If you like what it is that we're talking about here, just go ahead and press that subscribe button. Let's get this show going.
Destiny. You and I have a rendezvous with destiny. You and I have a rendezvous with destiny.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
Well, I'd like to welcome our panel back today, and we're going to talk about the Democratic Convention. For those of you who will be watching this, today is day 2 when we're recording this. We all watched snippets or parts of or pieces of, I happen to watch all of the Democratic Convention, but we're going to analyze it. However, we're going to analyze this from a different point of view. We're going to try to analyze this from the viewpoint of an independent. Now, I'm going to tell you why I think that's important. Let me start with this first slide. So if you look at this slide, what's important for you to note is that most of us know this in America, but it's not the popular vote that wins an election. You have to get to 270 electors in all of the different states to win. And what you can see here, if you look at it, all of the blue states represent states that Democrats are going to most likely win. The red states are the ones that that the Republicans will most likely win. It's the gray states that are in play. Now, it's possible that a couple of these states come off, but as an example, California, even if the election's on a landslide for the Democrats, you can pretty much bet that the Democrats going to win. And Democrats have been talking for a long time about winning Texas. I wouldn't bet on it anytime soon. I think Texas is going to go Republican, and most people agree with that. There are 7 states that are the states that are swing states. That includes Arizona, Nevada, Georgia, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin. You can maybe count Minnesota in that, and Michigan. Minnesota here is located in blue. But without those states, neither one of the 2 delegates, if you look up at the top of that chart, get to the 270 delegates to win. So the key is to win those states. I've campaigned in every one of those states in the past, trying to help out on different presidential candidates. And what I can tell you is, overwhelmingly, it is independents that are going to make that decision in those states. A long time ago, they used to be the undecided voters, but those undecided voters have all kind of moved into the independent camp. Now, this next slide that I'll show you is an actual slide taken from the Pew results of those 7 states. Now, Pew is a polling company. And what they did that I thought was a terrific job is they looked at voters from a different perspective. Instead of looking at them from Democrat, Republicans, and independent, they looked at those independents that were overwhelmingly going to vote Republican, those independents that would overwhelmingly vote Democrat, and then they began to pick out those independents that were truly independent. Now, there are characteristics that you will find on these independents, and I can tell you what the 2 big characteristics are, maybe 3 big characteristics. One is they tend to be fiscally more conservative. They're pro-business. They tend to believe in free market economics, but they're socially liberal. They tend to be supporters of civil rights and education and those types of issues. Now, that's not true with all of these independent voters. I'm just telling you, the majority of them in polling that I've seen, that's the characteristic that exists. Well, look at these states. I mean, you can see it's almost half of the independent voters in each one of these states that start falling into that category. And those are the independent voters that truly you have a chance at being able to go either way. Now, I'm going to start with my panel, and let me do an introduction to each one of them, and they can disagree with this if they would like. I've known these 4 gentlemen for quite a long time. I always like to say Lord Henry the shortest time, and I've gotten to know him pretty well. And here's what I will tell you about each one. First, Bob Robb. I've known Bob Robb since I was on the city council. He was, at the time, a consultant. He began to work for the Arizona Republic. he was considered a conservative columnist. But my argument would be, number one, as I knew him, he was always very fair to people on both sides. He just had a point of view. However, in recent times, he's broken with MAGA. So it's not conservative MAGA. MAGA defines conservative very different than maybe William F. Buckley would have defined conservatism years ago. And Bob is a true independent. He may or may not vote for a Democrat this year, but the reason he would vote for a Democrat is because of how much he disagrees with what's going on MAGA's side. The point isn't how he's going to vote. The point is he has an independent point of view.
Just to amplify it, I always have been a Reagan-Buckley conservative. I remain so today. For most of my adult life, the Republican Party was an acceptable vehicle for the effort to advance that traditional conservative policy perspective. Trump and the MAGA movement challenged the possibility of the Republican Party being the avenue for that kind of political activism. But what really broke it for me was Trump's attempted coup after losing the 2020 election. And the overwhelming support for his efforts among Republican officials and office holders, particularly here in Arizona. And even before the January 6th attack on the Capitol, I had decided I could not even be nominally affiliated with that party, and I re-registered towards the end of December that year, again before the attack on the Capitol, as an independent. But since my ideology hasn't changed, the existing political configuration offers me only highly, highly unpleasant options.
You actually say unpleasant like it's actually distasteful, but I understand what you mean. All right, so Eliott. Eliott Pollack is one of the best economists, I think, in the country. He's very good at being able to kind of predict where things are going. I've known Eliott, again, since I was in my 20s. Eliott, at the time, had worked for, I believe it was Valley National Bank, went on to own his own company, and today does lots of analysis for lots of different business groups. Now, that's my take on Eliott. Eliott has always had a social conscience, but he wasn't political at all, in my opinion. Now, again, maybe I didn't know his whole life, but he just wasn't a very political person. He was a rational person that believed in principles that were based upon good economics. And those principles were generally, they may have been considered to be more conservative principles, but what they were really supporters of were things like the free market, free enterprise, the belief that supply and demand works. It's the fundamentals, maybe a Milton Friedman type of look at the economy. I call him an independent because I think he always has been in his own right, although maybe independent lean right. But Eliott, I'll let you give your own description. And again, this is important because as we're reviewing these issues, I want you to know everybody's perspective.
Well, again, I'm the typical economic conservative, socially more liberal. And I was the only party, I was for a few years a Republican. I quit that and became essentially a libertarian. I was a registered libertarian, probably one of the only two in Arizona. And because I really, those beliefs are more mine. The less government, the better. And I still believe that. The choice I have to make, to me, is abhorrent. I vote for somebody whose policies are mainly okay, but who as a person I can't stand. Or I vote for somebody whose track record is really bad, okay? And so I am torn. I have no idea what I'm going to do. I probably won't know till I step in the voting booth. But the bottom line is that the country has gone so far to extremes, I can't, in all good conscience, make a decision. And to show you how socially liberal I am, just because it's something. I don't understand why abortion is an issue and why government should get involved. I personally believe it's totally conscience of the individual. And so when I hear all these arguments about abortion, I just shake my head. It is not something government should be involved with. On the other hand, from an economic standpoint, government takeover of the economy, and if you include everything that is government, everything that is paid for by the government, and everything that is the cost of compliance, it's nearly 50% of GDP at this point, and includes healthcare. And that, to me, is not what the founding fathers had in mind. And I have a real problem with that. So as I sit here today, I have a real problem with either party.
All right. And then last is our friend Henry Thomson. And Henry, here's what I would say. First, Henry comes from New Zealand. I've said about 1,000 times Australia, which has kind of put me in the felony dumb category, according to some people who actually write in. But nonetheless, Henry is probably the least political of the group, and he is a true historian. Now, that doesn't mean he doesn't have a philosophy or an idea of how he sees the world. He's written a couple of books, and he's writing a new one. My take on Henry is, while he came from kind of a more conservative basis of politics in New Zealand, he is truly interested in facts and understanding what really happened and trying to make certain that that we look at things from a rational point of view. But what's most important about Henry is that his writings, at least, side against the slip towards authoritarianism. I have no idea. He's the one person on this panel that I don't have a clear view of where I think he's going to end up actually going in the campaign itself, and I think he does that somewhat intentionally. But because of that, I put him in the independent category.
Thanks, Paul. This is fun, having my political views described by someone else. It's never happened to me before. Only behind closed doors people whisper about me, maybe. Or maybe I'm flattering myself, but anyway, who cares? I think the important thing for me, for American listeners to realize, is that I didn't grow up in America, so I don't have one of these strong party allegiances to one of the parties. I think that a lot of what we call party ID in political science, it comes from people's family backgrounds and the way that they were raised. And because I don't have that, I'm a little bit of a strange bird in the context of American politics. And the second thing is that I've lived in many different developed countries, mostly developed countries. So I've lived a long time in New Zealand, where I'm from. I've lived a long time in Germany, and I lived a long time in Britain, and then I've lived in America now for almost 15 years. So I kind of had witnessed a lot of different public policies, a lot of different political systems trying to address similar problems, as I've moved around these 4 countries, I guess you could say. And it's no coincidence that I've ended up wanting to move back to America, because I think that America's actually done a pretty good job dealing with a lot of the challenges that it's faced since the early 2000s, maybe, especially since the financial crisis. So I guess I'm broadly supportive of the American political system. The American political economy, I think, has generated pretty good results, whereas a lot of the other places I've lived have, quite frankly, not performed as well. And so I'm always looking at why America has performed better than others. And I think that a lot of that has to do with the fact that our government is smaller in America, and there's more private enterprise, more innovation, more entrepreneurship. And so that's something I'm really deeply convinced that that's a unique part of the American success story. And even over the last 10 or 15 years, I think has allowed America to really outpace the rest of the world and progress socially, economically. So that's kind of where I stand. Is I think that is a really important part of what makes America America, and any slipping towards a more European style of social democracy like I witnessed in Germany or in the UK, or even where I'm from in New Zealand, I'm pretty dubious about that, because I just haven't seen it be particularly successful in other places.
All right, and a small description on myself. I was a Democratic mayor. Before that, I was a Democratic council person, and I'd been a registered Democrat my entire life. Now, that may have been, I said before the show started, my dad was a staunch libertarian, but to the point that he just did not like government whatsoever. My mom was a Kennedy liberal, and I think it would have broke her heart if I'd have registered any other way, so I became a registered Democrat. I can tell you, in both of my first two campaigns, I had to knock on Republican doors, independent doors, and Democratic doors because it was a nonpartisan election. And I listened to a lot of Republicans in that process. And it had an effect on changing my point of view. And here's how it changed it. I believe I was a Democrat because I believe strongly in civil rights, equal rights, and human rights. I think everyone being able to participate is important, both socially and economically. I think the more buyers and sellers you have, the better off your economy is going to do. But when I'd knock on Republican doors, it was a little different than Democratic doors. Oftentimes there were small business people. And when you would listen to the effect of regulations and taxation and the harm that it would do to them, their stories were compelling. In fact, this will sound a bit odd. I was moved a lot by the stories of Martin Luther King and people who were oftentimes oppressed or that had been harmed in the minority communities, and I felt like they should have an equal chance. The stories of small entrepreneurs is equally as moving. It's a story about people who are out there struggling to employ people and to make certain that they're providing for a product and making a living, hopefully, in the process at the same time. Oftentimes that have invested every penny that they have in some venture to try to make it better. And it seems like the government sometimes thinks that their job is to figure out how many of these companies they can bankrupt with regulations. It became clear to me that that was a group that needed assistance as well, and they provided a lot to the American system. Now, over time, those views have evolved, and I'm an independent today, but I'm an independent today because I don't like the excesses of either party, as Eliott was saying earlier. I think that the excesses, once I registered as an independent, it was interesting how much easier it was to identify the excesses of the Democratic Party. Man, I could identify the excesses of the Republican Party in a terrific way when I was a registered Democrat. But I didn't really spend much time thinking about the excesses of the Democratic Party. Once you step back from it, you start to recognize that they both exist. Now, let's, if we can, let's go to the convention itself. Now, I watched the convention. There were lots of different parts of it. I want to start at the end because I thought that the end was interesting. Joe Biden gave his speech. In his speech, it was somewhat moving. I think Joe Biden did the right thing. I think Joe Biden stepping back not only was the right thing for the country, the right thing for his party, I think it was the right thing for him. And it was the right thing for him because by stepping back, he allowed his legacy to be seen from a different perspective. Now, I didn't think it was a great speech. I can't figure out why it is that people at conventions think that they give a better speech when they scream. And he was kind of screaming, in my opinion. And maybe that's because when he did the debate, when he tried to be more passive, he looked tired and weak. And maybe this was his way of trying to pick up that game. But nonetheless, if you listened, I thought that there were moving parts to it. I also think that it was effective for independence. It was effective for independence, in my opinion, because I'm not sure that the criticism of Donald Trump was as effective. I get why they have to do that, but I think that moves the base more than it actually moves independence. I think his portion of the speech where he was talking about the things that he got done, even though I don't completely agree with the things that he got done, I think independents want to see people who actually accomplish something in politics. And I thought that part of his speech was moving. I thought it was also important for independents because I think the idea that he did step back is helpful. The Republicans are trying to frame that as he did it because he was forced into it, which may or may not be true. I don't know what the facts of that are, but it's obvious to me why they're doing that. They're doing that because they don't want to make it. They want to make it look like his ambition was there, but there was just a coup that took place on the country. Nonetheless, I thought it was effective. I'd love to hear all the panel's point of view. Bob, you first.
I did not think it was effective, but I also think it is irrelevant, and everything that happens at this convention is irrelevant up until Kamala Harris's own address to the convention hall. Those who find Donald Trump so unacceptable that they will vote for Harris irrespective of policy disagreements or anything else, are already there. And so while I think that it is both acceptable and inevitable that reciting Trump's sins will be part of the Democratic convention, I don't think that there's a lot of additional votes to be gained to get the independent voters, the true independent voters that you described. They've moved in recent weeks to Harris. And I think, and I don't have any data to back this up, this is just an old political observer's sense of what's happening out there. I think it has to do with personality and likability, for want of a better term. Trump's a nasty character, and he has proven himself in this period after Harris became the nominee to be that. And she has a much more, particularly in contrast to him, pleasant political persona. And I think the way that she projects herself on Thursday night is the key ingredient to continue that momentum in her direction, which I don't think is policy oriented or anti-Trump. It's just one guy's sort of a nasty lout, and she seems to be a more pleasant person.
Yeah, I think personality does play into it.
Yeah, I agree with almost everything Bob said. I'm really struck by how much this campaign has turned into a discussion of personalities and personnel rather than about any real serious policy issues. And especially with Biden dropping out, this has become so paramount because it's become so important for the Democratic Party to smooth this transition, to present the party as united, to tamp down any dissent within the party loyalist ranks. And that's how I view this convention, that it's been very carefully stage managed to achieve that purpose. But at the same time, I think that there are such huge policy pressing issues at the moment in the United States. And I do think that, they are significant in a sort of for the next few decades, how we deal with the national debt and aging population, these sorts of questions. I don't think they're going to get an airing at all. And so I'm watching to see how they manage this transition between personnel. But like Bob, I'm a little aghast, to be frank, at how little serious policy debate we're being offered here among these candidates, given the problems that are coming really fast down the track to meet us.
I think, Henry, the reason for that, the reason that the policy debate isn't working and personality is working, Trump letting him off the hook. When you spend all your time talking about, what is it, tampon Don or whatever the latest slur that he has for the vice president, and you talk about somebody, that your opponent slept their way to the top, all of a sudden issues like immigration and issues like economic development or the budget deficits, issues where Trump actually could perform much better, end up disappearing because, as Bob said, it becomes a contest of personality. My own personal opinion is, I don't know that Donald Trump could win a contest of personality with almost anybody I know. But he does have some issues, whether I like them or not, doesn't matter. He has some issues that independents seem to like.
Well, again, I watched. I did something I hate to do. I watched both Fox and CNN extensively, and I usually try to avoid both of them, because right after the transition to Kamala Harris, just to see what she was going to say and how she was portrayed. And again, it's all about personality, but no substance whatsoever, and you're not even sure you're getting her personality. You're getting the scriptwriter's personality. So I don't know what she is. I will tell you that her economic package scares me to death, and will hasten what Henry left, us going to where the place that Henry talked about that he left, Germany and New Zealand, that are essentially socialist democracies. And it scares me to death. I'm a great believer in equality of opportunity. I am not a believer in forcing equality of result. That depends on the human being that's involved. So I think you're going to see a lot more personality. I agree with you that Trump is so busy being Trump that he's letting the issues just slide away. And I'm just kind of dismayed by that.
All right. So, Eliott, I'm going to start with you on this question. And we will come to the economy at the end. But here's an observation.
Yeah.
So the Biden administration, I think, has been, I think that if you look at what they've done for Israel, they've provided Israel pretty much everything that they needed. They've played a game a little bit between looking as if they're opposed to what Israel is doing while at the same time supporting their efforts. I'm not quite sure where Kamala stands on this issue, other than when the Gaza protesters or the Gaza people stood up and interrupted her speech. She was pretty forceful at trying to put them back down and saying, hey, you guys have a point, but right now I'm trying to make a point. Outside of the convention, there are people from Gaza there are people who are supportive of Palestine who are marching on the streets, large groups of demonstrators. Inside, it was very obvious to me there was almost no discussion on it. Even AOC, which I know is a big supporter of theirs, she way played it down, as did Biden. What I'm interested in, I know you're a big supporter of Israel, but for people who are a supporter of Israel, for people who are in the Jewish community, I know you can't speak for all of them, but I'd love to have your opinion on this. That conflict that exists, does it give you a level of distrust for her, or is it just not an issue, at least so far in this campaign? How do you see that?
I see it as a huge question mark that, again, actually scares me to death. To be honest with you, what's going on in the Mideast is horrible. It's horrible on both sides. But I don't know what you do when your neighbor's trying to cut your throat. So it's a very difficult situation. There is no cutting the baby in half. And so her positions, the unknown of her positions actually bothers me a lot. And that's especially true now that it appears that Iran's going to have nuclear weapons. And I don't think for a second, come November 6th, they won't try something. But I don't know. I haven't seen assurances from her. She's in a tough position. Her background would lead me to believe she'd be tougher on Israel than Biden has been. But unless you have both sides wanting peace, there will be no peace. And I just don't see that at this point.
Yeah, I mean, the one thing I certainly agree on is this, and that is defending what is happening in Palestine. You need to start with who is really the oppressors. And the oppressors are Hamas. And the oppressed are the Palestinian people.
Yes.
It's not, Israel's not the big bad guy in this. Hamas is the big bad guy in this. And that ranges in everything from how they oppress women to how they oppress people who are gay to how they oppress people in their right to vote.
I thought that the Palestinian conflict was the most important part of Biden's speech, perhaps the only important part. There was not a single word about the need for Israel to be able to defend itself. There wasn't anything except a passing reference to the horrific attack by Hamas on Israel. It was all about the need to have peace in Gaza. And he said that the protesters on the street had a point. Well, peace in Gaza means forcing Israel to stop short of decimating Hamas's grip and ability to take action to the maximum extent possible. There is no way in which he made that about the only thing he discussed about this particular conflict. without the approval of Harris and her campaign. Now, Harris herself has been strong in saying that Israel has a right to defend herself, but she's also been stronger than Biden previously on the need to reduce the human carnage that's occurring in Gaza. But I thought that the fact that Biden concentrated exclusively on the need to impose a peace in Gaza was very noteworthy and sort of an indication of Harris's proclivities.
And the dangerous part about that, you've said on past shows something to the effect of, if we're the ones who are actually imposing the peace, then we're going to be the ones that end up having to enforce the peace. And I'm not sure that Americans are going to like that idea at all.
I think that, again, we're not going to see a particularly substantive discussion of foreign policy at this convention because the Biden foreign policy record is so bad. And so the Democrats, and especially Kamala Harris, don't really want to be associated with her. I mean, it's hard to point at any positive achievements of the Biden administration in foreign policy. And in fact, the Obama administration before it was weakest on foreign policy. So I don't think there's going to be much said about foreign policy. I don't think there's really much of a plan there. So I just think they won't talk about it. That's what I'm expecting. Call me cynical, but I just don't think they're going to talk about it. Whether it's Ukraine war, which seems to just basically been parked in a sort of a too hard box, or the Gaza conflict seems to be a little more effort there, but I don't think there's really much prospect for any positive resolution. And then the elephant in the room is the China situation. And no, I don't think there's going to be any substantive discussion of those foreign policy problems whatsoever.
All right. So the one area of policy that they did talk about yesterday, if you were watching, was the abortion issue. Now, again, I'll declare from my standpoint, I know there are different opinions on this, even on this panel, but I'm pro-choice. However, I think one of the things that happens with independence is it's really an issue of how you prioritize issue. Meaning, if you prioritize, if you're pro-life and you say that is the most important issue, and I only vote for people who are pro-life, I can almost guarantee you're a Republican. If you say, no, I'm pro-choice, I vote pro-choice, that's the top of the issue. If you're not pro-choice, nothing else matters, I can almost guarantee you that you're a Democrat. Independence, it's not a guarantee this makes you an independent, but if you say, well, I'm pro-choice or pro-life, but the economy is more important to me than being pro-choice or pro-life, you tend to, independents tend to have that position at a higher level. They may have a position on it, but it's not a priority. What happened yesterday that I thought was pretty powerful was they put up 3 different speakers who spoke about the issue of abortion. And what all 3 of them did was, I'm not going to hit all 3, but what the first one did was, it was an obvious family who had been planning to have a child. Something went wrong in the pregnancy. It threatened both the child and the mother in the late term, and they ended up having to have an abortion. But they were challenged on that. I believe they were from Texas because of the rules that was there. It was a very emotional, the way they presented the issue. The last speaker was a young woman who was raped by her father and got pregnant at 12 years old. And, hers was a very emotional story. But what they were doing on the abortion debate, in my opinion, was they were appealing to the center. Not so much that the center is definitely all pro-choice, because again, I've seen polling results on this and they're mixed in the middle, but they tend to be mixed with an ability to listen to the merits of both sides. And I thought that what the Democrats were doing, at least in that portion of the debate, was trying to appeal to those more moderate independent voters by presenting the challenges that come with being overwhelmingly, in trying to get rid of the ability to be able to make a choice. Now, arguably, Trump likes to say, that's not what I did. I sent it back to the states and I let the states decide. But I do think that this campaign is going to center somewhat on that issue. I'm not sure that would be my desire, but obvious to me that Kamala is going to make that a priority issue.
It's funny because I talked about these other countries where I've lived where they got so many things I thought wrong, especially in terms of economic policy. But funnily enough, in all of those countries, the abortion issue is nowhere near as contentious as in the United States. And I think the reason for that is that it has been treated as one issue among many. It has been discussed in legislatures and in campaigns for decades, and the population has reached some sort of a compromise along the way. Whereas in the United States, because of the position of the Supreme Court on this issue, those sorts of debates were not always allowed to the same extent. And now an issue that is very contentious and really is an important moral and ethical issue, and issue for religious people as well, extremely important, has sort of exploded all at once after having been under such a pressure cooker for so long. And so I think that what we're witnessing is the aftermath of the Supreme Court decision that's kind of thrown this debate open in a way that was never really allowed before. And the Democrats, I think, do have a better position on this with moderate voters, because Republican elected officials for many years were encouraged to take very extreme stances on abortion, and are publicly wedded to those positions in many cases still. And those positions, I don't think, are really in line with the polling data you see on moderate voters. So this is, as you noted, probably the biggest winning issue for Democrats this cycle. And it's no surprise that they're putting it front and center and trying to portray themselves as the reasonable ones and Republicans as the unreasonable ones. So I'm not surprised that this is taking on huge savings in this election.
Call me naive. Again, to me, it's totally an issue of conscience. The government should have no say in it. You need an abortion, you want an abortion, that's your business. You don't, that's your business. And I respect both sides. But my thing is, the only reason abortion is an issue is because the Democrats need it as an issue, because it's the only thing they can hang their hat on when it comes to policy. The only thing they can hang their hat on. And so they're going to keep on beating the drums. The fact is, in my opinion, it's much better that these decisions are made at a state level for only one reason. You're much more likely to affect the outcome at the state level than you are at the federal level. And so this has become, Jefferson's 13 laboratories has turned into 50 laboratories. There are going to be some that make great decisions and some that make lousy decisions, and some in the middle, but essentially it'll be at a level that's closer to the voters. Do I think the government has any say in it, or should have any say in it? No. But am I happier when it's closer to the voters and something like this? Absolutely. This issue after the election won't be such a big deal because the Democrats won't need an issue.
I don't think the political salience of the abortion issue is that it will have much of a role in causing swing voters to toggle one way or the other. I think its principal political salience is its ability to increase turnout among Democratic voters, particularly younger ones. And so I don't see the Democratic, from a strictly political calculation. I understand there's genuine sentiment about the policy on both sides, but in terms of the emphasis on it as a political tactic, I think it's more a turnout mechanism than an attempt to persuade swing voters to go one way or the other. And I think it has a lot of potential to do that.
Bob, you wrote a column this week, and it wasn't discussed yesterday at the convention. I doubt that it will be, but I thought it was a fascinating column on this whole concept of whether or not the Supreme Court, whether or not Joe Biden should try to change the Supreme Court and how things work. Can you give us kind of some background on that column and some of your thoughts on it?
Yes, I have been supportive of changing lifetime tenure to a staggered 18-year term of office for Supreme Court justices. I think that lifetime tenure has resulted in some distortions that the founders did not anticipate. We've been pushing nominations to younger and less experienced jurists. The most recent appointees have mostly been in their 40s, and frequently they've only had a couple years of experience at an appellate court level. Who gets to make the nomination is completely random. It's depending upon when a justice dies or retires, and there's gamemanship that goes into those decisions. There's gamemanship that goes into whether the Senate responds to a presidential nominee. Some of the criticism of the existing court is based in I think, sound belief that dirty politics was played when the Republicans in the Senate refused to consider Barack Obama's nominee for a seat and consciously held it open for the prospect of Donald Trump to fill it. With the 18-year staggered terms, each presidential term would have two appointees coming up, and so it would be routine. I would also support requiring that a presidential nominee for the court receive a up or down vote on the floor of the Senate. So I think that would get rid of a lot of the gamesmanship. And if you're appointing justices with experience at the appellate level that are in their 50s, an 18-year term protects their independence of judgment just as much as the current lifetime tenure. Unfortunately, Biden made his case for court reform by raising questions, making an attack on the integrity of and legitimacy of the existing court. And I'm one who believes that the current justices are actually moving jurisprudence in the right direction, back to the role of the court that the founders intended. He also is not willing to address the issue directly by seeking a constitutional amendment, which would require a very broad consensus that this is, irrespective of your view of judicial philosophy, a better way to balance independence and democratic accountability for the court than the current system. He instead is going to do proposes a dodge, where by statute, you in essence declare any justice that has served more than 8 years as kind of in a senior status. And that isn't what was intended by lifetime tenure. And I think that it's unwieldy. And then his ethics reform and his attack on the immunity decision, which I think was flawed, just makes it a partisan talking point and heads in the wrong direction, and I think unfairly maligns the existing court and makes reform, which I think is worth discussing, less likely rather than more likely. But I think that Harris has endorsed what Biden has proposed, and I think that this will be at least a subtext in the presidential campaign about one of the speakers at the convention referred to Trump's kangaroo Supreme Court. So you're going to see that as kind of a talking point, mostly to energize the base in the Democratic Party, which is still upset at the decision to overturn Roe v. Wade.
Yeah, so my view, and again, Bob, I'll let you counter this, and then I'm going to ask Eliott the same thing. So we can have complaints about the Supreme Court. I don't, I can see where people have been challenged on any one of a different host of different decisions because that's what they do. They make judgment calls. In making those judgment calls, I think that the Supreme Court has remained fairly independent from our political system. It's not perfect, but it's remained fairly independent from it. And my concern is it becoming more political. I mean, it shouldn't be lost on people that when Trump tried to overthrow the election, there were 60 judges, a third of which were Trump appointees, who actually voted against him. In fact, almost every single judge did. You could argue they saved democracy. They ensured that it was going to continue on. They were independent. I don't know that term limits are a bad idea. That may make sense. And again, if you're going to do it, doing it by a constitutional amendment is good. But I think trying to berate the court in the process, trying to take them down, does damage to the one institution that may be saving us.
I would agree with that entirely, Paul, and that was my lament, that a reform that I think makes sense irrespective of what job you think the current court is doing, and I happen to think they're doing a good job, or what judicial philosophy you prefer, that this creates the balance and gets rid of some of the political gamesmanship that has infected our process of appointing Supreme Court justices. But you are right. The independence of our judiciary was very much a saving grace during this potential constitutional crisis.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think that if it had worked out that there were more liberal judges than conservative judges, I think Biden would be fine with that decision. This is purely a political thing. I don't like it at all because they're the least political of the checks and balances we have and are built into our system. I basically, Bob's idea is not a terrible one. I'd like to see term limits on congressmen and senators too. That's another issue. But the bottom line is that if you take a look at the data, most of their decisions are 9-0. Okay, about half their decisions, a little more than half their decisions are 9-0. Only about 6% of their decisions are this: I'm a conservative judge, I'm a liberal judge. Other than that, they basically cross-pollinate each other in terms of the decisions. So the reason it's an issue is because those 6% of the decisions that are along lines of the party that under which they were appointed are key issues. But generally, the Supreme Court is not a political organization, as can be seen by the small number of decisions that are Democrat versus Republican.
Yeah, I broadly agree with everyone. I think it's kind of a creeping criticism of those institutions that are supposed to be checks and balances and stand at least somewhat outside electoral politics, which are, becoming increasingly polarized, and that creepy politicization is a worry. I'd be interested to hear Bob talk a little bit more about these proposed reforms of Biden, because how would he propose to reform the Supreme Court if he wasn't going to pursue a constitutional amendment? That's what I'm wondering, is exactly what the mechanism would be for his changes.
I think what he was saying, but I'll let Bob speak for himself, he did want a constitutional amendment, didn't want to do it through the process that Biden was proposing.
Yeah, that's what I mean. What Biden's plan was, not what Bob was advocating.
Oh, I'm sorry.
It is to, by statute, say that after 18 years, a Supreme Court justice would no longer hear appeals decision, and that's 99.9% of the court's business is hearing appeals from lower courts. They would be replaced for that purpose. They would remain in a kind of senior status, and would continue to sit on cases where the court has original jurisdiction, and that's disputes between states, lawsuits filed by foreign governments. Very oftentimes, there's not any cases that come before the court during the year in which it has original jurisdiction. So you'd have this expanded panel for cases of original jurisdiction, and you would have no one who's served more than 18 years who would sit on the court's true business, which is to hear appeals. The argument is that this avoids violating the lifetime tenure provisions of the Constitution, because they would remain on the court, they would sit on any original jurisdiction cases that came up. But clearly, it's not at all what the founders intended by lifetime tenure, but that is the dodge.
And could the Supreme Court
They
overrule that,
proposed
Bob?
in
That was
Biden-
my next question. Yeah, would that measure be subject to judicial review, Bob? Would the Supreme Court potentially say this was not what the lifetime tenure was designed to do, and this is unconstitutional?
I think that's inevitable.
Oh man, what a
So we're right back to where we started from. All right, so let's go to this. Let's go to the last issue, which is the economy. And what I'd like to do is bring up this next slide, which was a poll that was done by Fox News. By the way, I believe this poll is just age 45 and older, so obviously it would be skewed if you included younger people. But I thought they did a nice job here of showing where Trump was winning and where Harris was winning. And Harris was winning on climate change and on honesty and trustworthiness, democratic elections, healthcare. She was losing on things like foreign policy, crime, being a strong leader, and the economy. What's interesting to me was that both of these two made a decision to put a focus on the economy the week before the Democratic convention. Now, Harris's speech on the economy was, we're going to try to save you money. We're going to save you money because all these big corporations are gouging you. I have this commitment from Eliott, who's going to do one of our series on housing to talk about really it's all about supply and demand as opposed to actually being about the need to put on things like rent controls. But those were the types of things that she was advocating for. Trump, on the other side, he talked about a no tax on Social Security, which would have a big dent on the budget. But he also talked about things like, he talked about issues like having more control over the feds. On the next slide, I think this is important to look at. You know, we've just mentioned a series of issues. And if you look at this, what you'll see is the economy is double the next issue. It's twice as important to all voters. And I guarantee you this actually is exemplified, or it's actually magnified when it gets to independent voters. After that is immigration, and it's down at fifth that the abortion issue exists, which would kind of play to what Bob was saying. I'm going to start with Eliott on this one, and I'll give my opinion, and I'd love to hear yours, but my opinion is neither one of these two are really doing a great job of presenting a coherent argument on the economy. In fact, the thing that I miss hearing from Trump is how the private sector can actually do a better job of solving these problems, why it is that budget deficits matter in that, why it is that regulations matter on that issue. But today, if you were to listen to both of them, I'm not altogether sure that both of them aren't talking about more government, bigger regulations, and in Trump's particular case with the feds, trying to gain more control.
Yeah, well, again, I would agree with that. It's a question of degree. Trump is a lot less than what Harris is talking about. What Harris is talking about as an economist scares the hell out of me. But the bottom line is that neither one is presenting great arguments that are coherent. And you can't say, well, we're going to provide you free health care, and we're going to provide you free schooling, and we're going to provide you all this free stuff. We're going to give you $25,000 to buy a house, all this other stuff, and not talk about, by the way, how do you pay for that? And don't tell me about taxing the rich. The top 1% or the top 10%, I think it is, has 48% of the income, or excuse me, 26% of the income, but pays 20 or 48% of the taxes. So they give 26% of the income, they're paying 48% of the taxes. You're already soaking the rich. The corporate taxes, it's a competitive world, and the reason that corporations and jobs left were because we had the highest tax rate in the industrialized world. That's changed, and so we're very competitive. Jobs are coming back. You can't ignore these things. But the thing that gets me most about Harris is she obviously has no trust at all, I mean at all, in the private sector. Anybody who took Economics 101 knows that if you have an industry that has 10 factors, 100 factors, 1,000 factors supplying you as your supply chain, you can't have price gouging. Why? Because everybody isn't going to move up to that gouging price. There's going to be some guy down here who says, I'm going to capture more of the market. I'm going to come in at a lower price with a reasonable profit margin. This whole thing about price gouging, especially in food, where there are so many factors in that industry, it's nonsense. It's just nonsense. And all she's going to do is create bureaucracies that hurt. And Nixon tried it, and he ended up with food shortages. And that's where we'll end up. I find that distrust of the private sector fairly scary.
Yeah, tell us what President Nixon did. I think that's actually
well, he
illustrative.
tried price controls, and what happened is exactly what you would think. Industries couldn't make any money, so they stopped providing as much supply, and you ended up with empty shelves in the grocery store at Safeway, and he basically backed off from that very quickly when that started to happen. I'm not sure Kamala Harris would back off that, but the bottom line is there's no basis in either theory or fact to suggest that the price increases came from price gouging. Where they came from is crappy economic policy on the part of Biden and, quite frankly, on the part of the Fed to monetize all those deficits. And I'm not talking about what happened during COVID, because that was, in my opinion, absolutely necessary to prevent the economy from going into a depression. But it's after January 20th, 2021, when he started to throw literally trillions of dollars at the economy, when the economy was already recovering. And that's what's caused inflation. And by the way inflation is calculated, it's over the last 4 years, it's been grossly understated. The rate of inflation, at least as measured by the Consumer Price Index, is probably 3 to 4 times higher than the 20% that people talk about. But that's another issue. But she's just coming into this. She's basically saying she wants a quality of result instead of a quality of opportunity. But more than that, she's saying she doesn't trust the private sector. And that suggests to me we're going to, again, move more quickly along the road to Germany and, the rest of Europe. And
before I move on, I want to ask you a separate question. And
sure.
By the way, I do agree with you. Actually, I think more importantly, I'm just going to deal with this from a political standpoint. I've seen polling. As I said, independents tend to be supporters of civil rights and equal rights, human rights, education. They believe in, they're more socially liberal, but they are more conservative. That's the right term, in that they believe in the private sector. They believe that the private sector actually does provide a benefit, and they're not anti-free markets. I want to ask you a question of something that came up this week, just because I'm trying to gain a better ability to try to understand this. And this was the move by the Biden administration to try and break up Google and maybe other companies. Now, I've been, I remember reading the book, I think it was Titan, that was about John D. Rockefeller and where the antitrust laws came from, and that the idea that he had grown so big that they decided that he had the ability to harm other elements of society. He had done them through trust, so they created this antitrust law to break him apart. Now, a couple of things was interesting, and the first one was there were a lot of people working in his company that in order for him to maintain a monopoly, he had to cut a deal with, and so they were really old business owners that didn't have to work. Once they broke apart the companies, they started shredding all the fat, and the companies actually became more profitable, and John D. Rockefeller actually became richer from the breakup, even though he wouldn't have anticipated that. He thought it was going to do harm to him. On Google, we have Waymo and YouTube, as well as Chrome and Android, all of which are these differing components. And on one hand, I look at that and say, and the one cool thing is that they have all this additional money that they can pour into things like Waymo, trying to figure out how to get a driverless car. On the other hand, my guess is there's probably a lot of inefficiency in that company because of how big it is. and it might become more profitable if there was some breaking apart from it. How do you look at that as an economist?
Remember the lawsuit against IBM that actually led to nothing because they were going to control the entire world of computing?
Yes.
It didn't work out that way. And that's because of what you just said, that big companies are inherently inefficient. They become staid and stuck in their ways. And with IBM, they made the decision when Gates tried to sell him his company. Guess what happened? They wouldn't buy Microsoft because, in their opinion, the future of computing was in hardware, not software. Oops. Digital equipment. They basically went out of business because they didn't see the need for small computers. Okay. Big companies tend to be inefficient. Over time, they will be eaten alive by small competitors. And all this is going to do is create a lot of noise and make a lot of headlines, but economically, it will accomplish nothing to go after Google.
All right, Bob, you had made a comment a couple of weeks ago, and I want to know if it's changing or getting worse. And the comment was this, that what Trump had done in the last election had just left you with an inability to be able to vote for him. But that Biden, week after week, was saying things and doing things that was making it more difficult for you to stay with him. Now, the reason I bring that up is, as I said, I think in many ways you represent the independent voter today. From Kamala, is maybe the most effective thing she can do is to say nothing? Or are you seeing her actually moving in that direction and making it more difficult for people like you to vote for her?
She continues the Biden process of making it more difficult to vote for her. And what Eliott was talking about, I think, was a prime example. In a column recently, I challenged the notion that American corporations gouging of prices is responsible for inflation by asking the question, if American corporations have all this pricing power, why did we have 4 decades of low inflation before we had an eruption of promiscuous fiscal and monetary policy? That's clearly what caused it. Now, in terms of inflation as an issue, I think neither candidate has much to offer, and both candidates are complicit in creating it. The promiscuous fiscal policy got supercharged during the Biden administration, but it began in the Trump administration. The COVID relief packages that were passed when he was president at his direction and urging spent tons of money that had nothing to do with fighting COVID. And he left office asking for larger giveaways, just money tossed to families, irrespective of whether they had actually been economically hurt by COVID. He's an easy money guy. He left office attacking viciously the Fed for not decreasing interest rates more, even though they were at all-time lows. And we were on the precipice of an outbreak of inflation that reached 9%. Now, on the economy generally, when you look at tax and regulatory policy, I think clearly his tenure as president, and I think except for tariffs, likely what would occur in a second term, is far more favorable to economic growth than what the Democrats are proposing. But my own impression is that the Democrats aren't really after center or center right independence on policy. They're going to rely upon abhorrence of Trump to gain whatever that vote they can, while they are turning it into more of a base election, trying to capitalize on the enthusiasm for Harris and trying to put back together the Obama coalition and to win a primarily a base turnout election and hope that they can get a fair share of center-right swing voters based upon abhorrence of Trump.
I just love that piece of analysis by Bob, and I just want to reiterate it. The structure of the American economy, including Google and the big supermarket chains, basically has remained unchanged for years, and yet we saw a sudden spike in inflation after the pandemic. How are we supposed to explain something that changes dramatically with something that doesn't change at all? It just doesn't bear up to even the most superficial of analysis. So I just wanted to call that out for Bob again. Nice work there. But, I think that this is a disappointing election campaign so far for the people that are crying out for help on this issue of inflation, right? We were talking at the start of the show about how this is all about personalities and we're not getting a substantive policy discussion. I mean, look at what people's policy priorities are. Inflation, prices, people are desperate for some sort of assistance or at least some sort of a real plan on this issue. And I think it's clear that the Harris campaign doesn't have one. I don't think that voters are going to believe his claims about price gouging by the food sector. And I don't think they're going to believe the claims that price controls are going to work. I don't think that's going to stand up. And I actually predict them walking it back. They probably already are walking it back, that particular policy proposal. But more importantly, as Bob hinted at, we don't really see a commitment to a sound economic policy that's going to address the fundamentals of this problem from either candidate. And that's why they're getting away with having this superficial campaign rather than digging into the policy, because I don't think that Trump has a real plan for dealing with this inflation problem either, especially when you look at some of the things like, as Bob mentioned, increasing spending by the federal government. It's going to produce even more demand for goods and services, and many of these are plans for higher tariffs that are definitely going to affect consumers. So I think that particularly low-income people who spend a really large proportion, essentially all of their take-home income goes on food, utilities, and rent, especially these days, they're not being offered anything in this election. And it is a little galling to hear all this discussion about how the parties are reaching for the working class vote and all these things. I just think is complete and utter nonsense, and I could use stronger words. But if you're out there right now paying rent that's doubled since 2019 and paying food prices that have gone up by 25-30% since 2019 and paying utility prices that are going up as the so-called attempted Green New Deal is trying to sort of rejig the electricity grid on the fly, I have bad news for you. You got at least 4 more years, because there's not going to be a big change.
If a presidential candidate truly wanted to do something to contribute to reducing inflation, they would be proposing things to get the federal deficit more under control. It is scheduled to be $2 trillion this fiscal year, which ends in September, and there's no indication that it's going to be less in whatever Congress decides as a stopgap measure going forward into the next fiscal year. But instead of, and those deficits create inflationary pressures. It makes the Fed's job of bringing inflation under control more difficult and creates difficult choices for the Fed. But instead of doing something that would actually be within their power, that could contribute to bringing inflation under control, each candidate, every time they open their mouth, is adding hundreds of billions of dollars to the deficit. It is headed in exactly the opposite direction of a constructive role that they could play as president in responding to the public concern over inflation.
Yeah, it's bad news. I totally agree with Bob. And I mean, Trump, to some extent, he talks about deregulation, and particularly in the energy sector, I have some hope that Trump policies would reduce inflation on energy, but otherwise I don't see a lot, especially not a sustainable solution going forward, as you highlighted, Bob, which would have to include consolidation and reduction in federal spending. I don't see anything, and it really makes me kind of sad when I look at these policy priorities, because it's all of us, whether you pay for daycare or rent or a combination of all of these things that people are just really getting slammed at.
This is, by the way, new territory, because generally deficits go up during periods of slowdown and then come down. Like John F. Kennedy said, the time to fix the roof is when the sun is shining. Well, the time to fix your budget is when the economy is good, because you basically have more revenue, your deficit's lower. We not only have $2 trillion facing us next year, but we do the year after that, and the year after that, and the year after that, and the year after that, without all these giveaways that Harris is talking about. And, she's going to come out and say, well, we'll raise taxes and that'll take care of it. The history of these programs the programs cost more than you expected, but the taxes basically are done in the models are static. In other words, they don't believe that higher taxes will change people's behavior. Well, it does. So people tend to governments get less taxes when they raise the tax rate. Less tax than they expected.
A recession, Eliott? All of these things are when the economy is running in some sort of a steady state. If we have a recession, people aren't paying taxes, they're drawing unemployment benefits.
They have no cushion. It's very scary.
On these deficits as well. Nobody is taking any of these questions seriously. I love that meme of the little dog sitting in the burning house drinking a cup of coffee saying this is fine, because it so often applies to public policy. But I feel like that is the perfect scenario for both of these political conventions this year.
Well, I absolutely agree with you. Nobody knows. Here's the scary part. This all goes to the value of the dollar and the ability of America to get away with being the prettiest house on an ugly block, which is where we stand economically. At some point, if anybody were to ever figure out how to get another reserve currency or a basket of goods that it could act as a reserve currency, the U.S. would be in big trouble. It's just a question of time until the dollar is significantly devalued, either by the marketplace or simply inflation locally. Because every day that you have inflation, you're devaluing the dollar. You're buying less goods. We just don't know whether it's going to happen 10 days from now or 20 years from now, but it will happen.
All right. So here's how I'm going to wrap this up, because I think this is important. One of these two sides are going to win, and then one of these two sides are going to lose. And the real question becomes, what does the losing side learn? What do they learn from this campaign? Now, I happen to believe that it's important that independents actually continue to speak up, because right now in the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, they are both in this mix where they are being drawn hard by their far right and by their far left. If you read any of the articles on this, the far right has been actually attacking Donald Trump, thinking that he's not going far right as they think that he should be going. And they're putting pressure on him. The white nationalists, some of the racists, people who want more isolationism than he's been willing to give. And Kamala's been facing the same thing on the far left. Now, they both tend to avoid talking about those subjects. Neither one of them are really talking about the issues that most independents care about. Let's go to the next slide here, and I'll tell you a little story. Now, you could look at this slide in one of two ways. The first one is that I'm a narcissist that loves to try to promote myself. But nonetheless, this was the 1992 Democratic Convention. I got to give a speech at that particular convention because I'd run the campaign for a guy named Paul Tsongas. Paul Tsongas he'd run against Bill Clinton in this particular race. And when he came to Arizona and asked me to support him, I was mayor at the time, I didn't think he had a chance. And in fact, I was sure he didn't have a chance. Bill Clinton had literally organized every single Democratic leader inside the state with the exception of me. And I asked him, I said, Paul, look, you're supporting, you have a very pro-business agenda. You're talking about a balanced budget. You know, on the Democratic side, he was a big supporter of human rights at the time. But I said, those other two issues, they're not popular with the Democratic constituency. What is your plan to be able to win? And he said, well, Paul, he said, I hope I can win. He said, I'm going to give it everything that I can. And he said, but he said, look, Bill Clinton is pandering to the base. He's pandering to them. He's telling them everything that they want to hear. He said, I had cancer. Paul Tsongas said he had cancer, and he said that he had gone through chemo, and he remembered when he was going through it, literally being worried about the future of our country and whether or not maybe they had overspent and whether or not living within the budget was important. So he got involved in this thing called the Concord Coalition that was about balancing the budget. Any event, what he said to me that was so powerful was he said, look, I can't promise you that we're going to win, but maybe we can change the narrative. Maybe we can get people to start to think about the role that they should play. Now, at the time, America West Airlines in Arizona was on strike, and they were having a big issue there, and they wanted us to help bail out the airlines. And so I asked him to come and speak to the labor leaders that were in Arizona, and he said, Paul, I am not going to bail out an airline. I think that's a terrible idea. He says, in fact, that's just going to add to the budget deficit. Here's what we need to be doing. And I said, that's what I want you to do. I want you to come here and tell them exactly that story. He did. Now, we did win in Arizona. I believe that event was part of why we won, because once people saw him bow his back to a labor union saying, no, this is what I believe and I'm not going to give in on it, it actually had a huge effect on independents that were in Arizona. But here's the long-term effect. Go to the next slide. This is the budget deficits that we've just got done talking about. Now, if you look at 2020, that was the end of the Trump term. You can see that it was a massive deficit. You can see that Biden has kind of kept it up high during that period of time as well. But look at those blue ones. Those blue ones were Bill Clinton. Are talking about the budget deficit, as well as Ross Perot, who did it in the general election, put Bill Clinton in a position where he at least saw the importance. And so when Republicans took over the Congress, he compromised and he was willing to actually come up with a budget surplus as opposed to a budget deficit. This is my point. Elections really do work. They actually do have an effect, right? But you have to speak up and you have to keep talking about what's important. There's a view amongst independents. And if the group that doesn't cater to them, that ends up winning or losing, when the loser group goes back out and tries to figure out what they did wrong, if they start thinking about those independents, then maybe a candidate runs who starts talking about how important this issue is. I think there's no single greater issue than the budget deficit. I think it is a huge long-term problem for us. It competes with the private sector for capital. It's providing a much bigger government. And in providing a much bigger government, they actually can provide for more regulations and clamp down on business even tighter. But the point I'm trying to give on this is, I think speaking up works. I think people who talk about things actually make an effect. If you would have gone back to the end of that election when I gave that speech, we were giving a concession speech. And the reason that I was able to give that was because Paul Tsongas he had a relapse on cancer, and they didn't know that he was going to be able to speak. And so I got to go up and talk. As it turns out, he improved some and was able to give a speech later in the convention. But we were talking about losing. Yet I look at this and say, sometimes you can lose and still win. So Bob, I'm going to start with you, and then we'll wrap this up with everyone else giving their final comment. What do you think it's going to take for us to begin to change either the Democratic Party, the Republican Party, or for that matter, giving rise to independents, to ensure that we start having this alternative voice, that start talking about some of these issues that we've talked about here today?
I don't think it will come from politicians like Tsongas changing the national discussion and the policy framework within which our elected officials operate. I think unfortunately, it will require the intervention of external events. We are already seeing a substantial increase in what the federal government has to pay for this debt that is having a crowding out effect. We have the inability to continue to pay Social Security benefits as promised, occurring basically a decade away. Another deadline in terms of our ability to meet the commitment for the hospitalization fund under Medicare. Eventually, people will not be willing to loan the federal government unlimited sums of money at very low interest rates, particularly if the deficits are so large that the Fed feels some obligation, as Eliott described it, to monetize them. So I hate to say it, but I think some kind of external force will be necessary before our politicians will be willing to confront it. If there was ever a year for someone to run the Zongus Ross Perot campaign about fixing the finances of the federal government, this was it. You had two fiscally irresponsible candidates in the two major parties and widespread dissatisfaction. No one arose. No one within either party. In the Republican primary, there was no discussion of having a sound fiscal policy going forward and getting the finances of the federal government at least to a more manageable level. And I don't see that opportunity re-arising in 2008. And it may be before 2008 that we have these external factors force a reckoning. It will be ugly and painful.
I agree with Bob. I look back to history and I look at the 70s and what it took for Reagan and Thatcher to have to emerge with these ideas about reforming the economy. And in hindsight, I think we got really lucky with Reagan and Thatcher because we didn't have hard left backlash. We got through that time that did involve very high unemployment, involved inflation, real difficult economic conditions for a lot of people across the developed world. And we got through it without a much more radical backlash. And we emerged into that era that you described, Paul, of a sort of a compromise, right? Where even a left-wing politician like Bill Clinton was willing to say that markets work and we want to have a sound, responsible fiscal policy. I think we got really lucky. A few other things went in our favor too. The Soviet Union collapsed. Few other things. Unfortunately, CCP didn't collapse. They cracked down in Tiananmen Square, but 2 out of 3 I bet. I worry that we're not going to see that type of a fortuitous response to the next crisis that, according to a lot of these figures, seems to be coming down the pike. And I worry that what we're seeing already is the response to that increasing crisis and inflation, that the response is going in the radical left and the radical right direction, and is only going to make things worse. And I really do ask myself, can we get lucky a second time with a moderate outcome to this type of a economic crisis that seems to be impending? And I really hope that we do. I really hope that we do.
Yeah. Two things, two words, okay? One is so much of the budget is locked in stone that there's no fluff. There's nothing we can do if something goes wrong. Defense spending as a percent of GDP is the lowest it's been since 1939. We're facing the possibility of 3 wars, and we got old equipment, and we don't have any place to get the money. And so if something goes wrong, it's going to be a real problem, because you talk about large deficits. We'll finance through deficits until nobody will buy our bonds. If something goes wrong, we have no fluff. That's the first thing. Second thing is my hope would be that if Trump loses, he goes away. I think if he loses, that he will end up being one of the worst things that ever happened to the Republican Party. And why do I say that? Because I believe that any reasonable Republican, and there are some, who was running for president would run away with it. And in fact, one of the only people who could lose to Harris is Trump. If indeed he wins, I don't know what happens to the Democratic Party, whether they become more centrist or they continue going out to the left. I'm hoping that they become more centrist, but there's no guarantees of that. So I'm kind of lost as to what happens next. It could be very good or it could be very bad. But whoever wins, if there's something that happens bad internationally, boy, we got real problems.
All right. Well, I'm going to be the one that stays optimistic. Gentlemen, thank you very much for all that we spoke about here today, and we will see you guys next week.
And we stand today on the edge of a new frontier, the frontier of unknown opportunities and perils. It holds out the promise of more sacrifice instead of more security. The new frontier is here.
You and I have a rendezvous with destiny. We'll preserve for our children this, the last best hope of man on earth, or we'll sentence them to take the last step into 1,000 years of darkness.